Well, thank you so much for joining us today and spending some time with us. We really appreciate you, and we appreciate you making some time to connect. What we're hoping to do is just talk about, obviously you want to talk about your book a little bit, right? Spirit and Sacrament. This is a great book, man. Thank you for putting this together.
Thank you very much. I love you produced it like that. I'll produce the book up,
Yeah, I got mine too.
It's a great resource for the church, and we've been going through it as a team, and it's been a real blessing to us. And so thank you for doing that. And really the purpose of this call is we wanted to just connect with you and talk, to just hear directly from you to help equip the church to be able to understand spiritual gifts and what that looks like for individuals, but even more so what it looks like for the church collectively together. But before we get into that, I think it'd be helpful, maybe if you don't mind, just telling us a little bit about yourself. That way, if there's some people who maybe don't know you or they haven't heard about you, they can meet you and get to know you a little bit.
Yeah, sure thing. Andrew Wilson. I'm the teaching pastor of a church in London, but I live in Eastbourne, which is a town on the south coast, about 60 miles away, which is a strange, whole other story. I've been married to Rachel for 18 years. I've got 3 kids. The older 2 both have quite significant disabilities, and that makes quite a big difference to our daily lives. I have been a Christian since I was a young adult, really. I've grown up in a Christian home, but I've been following Jesus really since my early 20s, and I've worked much of my adult life for the church. I also have a PhD in theology from King's College London, and I write a bunch of books on various things. And that's a start, right?
Yeah, that's okay. Good. Yeah. You're a gift to the church in many ways, and so we're grateful for you.
Thank you. And a part of the Mere Fidelity crew as well.
I am part of I never know whether anyone, I was going to say if anyone listens to that, that sounds bad, but I never know whether anyone knows what that is. But I do other things. I write for the Gospel Coalition and Christianity Today, Fidelity and stuff like that. So
I was going to make a joke that I won't crochet during the Zoom call.
That's quite niche, I suspect.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah, Pete can go deep with you in a lot of different ways, and so
I'm an associate pastor here at the church too. And just Mere Fidelity is probably like my go-to podcast of my most listened to podcasts of all podcasts. Yeah, so
it's
very very informative, and I love just all your guys' cadence and conversation and how you guys rib each other, and also talk about really great things and go very deep, and it's very helpful for the church practically. So.
Well, that's really great to hear. Thank you so much. That's very encouraging.
So let's talk about gifts, spiritual gifts. Maybe, maybe to start with, how do you, like when you think of the spiritual gifts, obviously there's a lot of clarity in Scripture regarding like what they are and why God gives them. But maybe to start with, why don't you just kind of give us your take on like what do you think the importance of spiritual gifts are for the church?
There's a lot of ways you could start that. I think if I went back to Pentecost, I think I would say that on the day the church is born, the way that the surrounding crowd see that something amazing is happening before they even listen to anything being said about Jesus is that they see spiritual gifts that have been poured out on the church. Now, they don't know to call them that. They observe the gift of languages, or often called tongues, but they observe that we don't know how many of the phenomena they see, how visible are these tongues of fire out in the street and all that sort of thing. But they are witnessing what we now would call the charismata, the spiritual gifts, the gifts of God being poured out on the church. And that draws them to even give a hearing to the gospel. And Peter has to defend against the charge of drunkenness and so on. And I think ever since the ministry of the Spirit in giving gifts, the God's work in the world is not simply done with a sort of a blast from the sky. That what God does is he gifts men and women and children. Your old men will dream dreams, your young men will dream dreams, old men will see visions, all across the age spectrum, all across the, sex, men and women, or across social strata, that God ministers to the world and to the church through taking hold of men and women and giving them gifts, which they then use to build each other up. And that's not obvious that God would have to do that. In fact, in the Old Testament, that isn't really what happens. God ministers primarily through a handful of very prominent individuals and leaders. And sometimes you might go for a century or two before you read a phrase, then the Spirit rushed upon so-and-so and clothed him with power. Whereas in the New Testament, you see that happening to all believers, and that all believers are expected to serve one another, not just as priests in a theological sense, but as ministers of the Spirit in the charismatic sense. And I think we, as you know, and we may get on to, there's lots of debates about exactly which gifts are for now and all that sort of thing. But even parking that for a moment, which I don't tend to do as a charismatic pastor, but even if I did, I'd say everyone agrees that the Spirit has come to equip the church by building us up with spiritual gifts together that serve one another and that serve the world. And so I think if you take spiritual gifts in that sense out of the church, you don't have the church. The dwelling place of God. It's the temple of the Spirit, and it's a place in which those gifts are to be shared and used. And so, we then need to get on to which ones count, which ones are valid, which ones still work today. But I don't think anyone would argue that a church can function without spiritual gifts in operation. There's just some debate about which ones they are and how they're supposed to be used and stewarded wisely.
Yeah, totally. We are kind of in the same vein as you are with believing in all the gifts and that they're all continuing today in play. And one of the things that I really did appreciate about your book is you kind of laid out like historically just like all this evidence for God not just giving the church the gifts in the beginning of the early church, but even how we've seen some of these gifts play out throughout history.
Yeah.
Maybe if you don't mind, just kind of talk a little bit about like when you think about the different movements of Christianity throughout history, right? From the early church until today, what part do you think the gifts have played in kind of the growth of the church as it has expanded across the world?
Yeah, I think probably is worth saying up front that there are periods of this history, either that because we don't have that many sources about them, or because I'm not an expert in that period, that I may miss or hopefully not misrepresent, but you never know. But I think I would give the short version to people go like this. In the book of Acts, it's clearly extremely prominent. In fact, and that's obviously the priority, that it's not just Pentecost, but throughout the book of Acts, when he wants to move the church into a new season of mission, he's almost always doing it through quite obviously supernatural means, through spiritual gifts. The Spirit said, I couldn't go there. He made me wait. Then a vision came and said, come over here. And then it happens all the time. Then I think in the first sort of, the next 300 years, between about 100 and say 400, you have a number of church fathers, the patristic period, they're often called the church fathers and actually some of the church mothers, although they wrote much less, bearing witness to the ongoing presence of a lot of the spiritual gifts, and particularly on the prophetic side, which is often the one that people are most nervous of continuing. But it seems to have been a lot of kind of gift taking place, the gift of languages, and obviously, and physical healings being in some ways the most undeniably frequent of them. That you get this sort of long section in The City of God by Augustine, which proves to be the next most important book in Christendom for the next 1,000 years, really. But it's just got a whole book in that book, or like what we would now call a chapter, but an extended chapter defending the ongoing presence of miraculous healing in the church to his day. He's not arguing with cessationists, really. He's arguing with people who don't believe that miracles ever have been a thing, but it's a very very long defense. And so in that sense, in the patristic period, there's a lot of witness to spiritual gifts. Then I think, as in some ways what happens is that in the church through the early medieval period, you actually find just a lot less witness to anything in the church. There's just less stuff being written. There's less novel theological exploration. And that's because in Europe in particular, the collapse of Rome means that there's just less writing more generally. It's a more peace, lack of peace, difficult to find peace. And so people don't spend time writing lots of theological tracts. Medieval period miracles are taking place a lot, or at least being a witness to a lot. But what we see is that something that begins in the early church period, but is now quite prominent in the high medieval period, so around 1000 to 14 or 1500, that there's a lot of association between healing and means of supernatural healing, like a relic or like a bone of a saint, or like a particular. In other words, there's some theological stuff that we now, as a modern Protestant, would go, hang on a second, I'm not sure what I think about that. But it does also seem to have been very, very common, and seems to have been widely attested to, obviously within what we now call the Roman Catholic Church. But that, I think, is worth knowing, because it sets the scene for why the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century pushed quite hard against some of that stuff and said, hang on a second, your understanding of prophecy means that you believe people can still speak new truth today that might rival scripture. Your understanding of apostles might mean that it does mean that you think that the Pope is still able to speak apostolic words that bind the church's conscience now, which they obviously didn't believe. And your understanding of healing is often connected with all sorts of other flummery that we don't agree with either. So the reformers pushed back quite hard against a bunch of that. None of them said there's no such thing as a spiritual gift today or anything like that. And none of them denied miracles. But what they did do was to put quite a lot of theological things in place to kind of narrow the scope and focus attention back on the word, which mostly was a very good thing, of course. But one of the things that one of its unintended consequences, in a way, is that it fenced in what the Book of Acts would see as normal spiritual life, and made it associated with potentially bogus either fanaticism on the one hand or Catholicism on the other. And so the Reformed Church has often stayed there. And in times of revival in the last 300 or 400 years, a lot of that stuff just burst back out again. And then you've had, particularly in your country in the last 200 years, perhaps a thread of revivalist, pietists, sort of passionate and emotional and expecting spiritual realities kind of Christianity that's run in parallel to a more formal, confessional, doctrinally precise, and often perhaps doctrinally better, to be honest, but also slightly lacking in some of those power and miraculous dynamics that we see in the Book of Acts. And those two tracks run in parallel in much of the Western, since really the Methodist revivals, in both your country and mine. And so in the last 100 years, Pentecostalism has particularly brought a lot of that back into the debate. But still to this day, by and large, churches that are theologically exacting and reformed generally go over here, and churches that are passionate about spiritual gifts being for today and speaking in tongues and prophesying generally go over here. And there's a handful of odd people, like I guess the three of us, sort of going, I think we can bring these together. And a lot of other people going, really, how does that work? So that's a short history of spiritual gifts.
Oh, that's so good. That is so good. So given that, right, given the fact that there's usually this kind of polarization in these two different tribes, and few are like us in the middle somewhere, right? How do you typically help someone if they're unfamiliar with, say, the more charismatic world, and they're coming maybe from a more reformed world? How do you help them balance out, and vice versa? If they're more charismatic and they're not less familiar with the reformed, how do you help them? So how do you help these two worlds come together? Like, what does that look like in your experience?
Well, I think it's easier when you have a church that is, for better or worse, but is trying to model that, because you can then say, come to church and see what it looks like, and then ask questions you have. I think often the conversations are more difficult when people have not seen. So on the charismatic side, they've never seen a version of Reformed theology that didn't seem starchy and formalist and harsh and all. And then to go, no. Honestly, there's a lot of happiness in, so for me, I use the Heidelberg Catechism a lot because it's such a warm, rich, sort of sunny document. I tend to go, this is what Reformed Christianity is like. And I know there's some of that as well with the beards, but actually that's not what mostly it is. And so you commend the most accessible form to somebody. And on the other side, it's also difficult if somebody has said, I've just never really been to a church in which the gifts are being used. And I think that somebody there is trying to be discerning and wise and, kind of probing, is this true? Is this God? Is this just nonsense? Is this the devil? What? I don't really see scripture being held up when this happens. I see that the whole church is getting obsessed with the phenomenon rather than with the presence of Christ and with the reality of the gospel. And so I think, again, if that's someone's experience, you're trying to show people. Probably the only advert I have at that point is to say, well, come to a church meeting in which this is being done well. Don't watch the God TV, God TV or whatever it is, and assume that everyone who believes in these spiritual gifts for today is doing that, because many of us are not. And I in that sense, I think sometimes the best advert I have, if I'm trying to get them to come along and see a church, then that's generally what will work. If they're not yet at that point, then I think there are writings, and often the more Calvinist type is more inclined to go, I'll read a book about it because I want to be persuaded if it's true. And so, obviously, that's probably why I've written the book that you're talking about, and people, many others. Sam Storms has helped a lot of people I know, and many others who have just tried to write in such a way that they commend this stuff biblically. But at the same time, I also want to honor the fact that at both extremes, there is a degree of truth in their perception of the other. So I think there is a lot of charismatic lunacy, and there is a lot of very starchy, formalist, and ungracious Calvinism. And I kind of want to validate that to a point as well and say, look, both of these things have been done very badly, just as the sacraments have been done badly in a lot of traditions, and evangelicalism is not without its problems. And so in other words, any time you have an objection to a general bucket of Christianity, I'll probably share some of those objections. Similar objections could be leveled against me. So I don't want to rule out the objections. Oh, no, none of them are like that. They probably are. But I think I often have tools or resources that I might be able to say, look, if you're really nervous of this might win you, or this at the least might give you a hearing, and give the view I'm proposing a hearing to somebody like you. But I want to accept that there are also reasons to have significant problems with it, and there often are, sadly.
Yeah. You mentioned about how like the way you kind of talk about it would be to invite someone to a church that is practicing that. So maybe just like practically, like for you as a pastor the teaching pastor at King's Church in London, like what does that look like for your guys' team, and even just for your church? Like, how do you balance both kind of like this, and spontaneity is maybe not the right word, but this expressive, you call it noisy, emotive, use of the gifts, and then also kind of these sacramental gifts of like communion, baptism, prayer, creeds, confession, where you're trying to hold together like the historical tradition of the church and that doctrine, that you have precision with also this joyful emotion of having the Holy Spirit prompt and urge you to interact with him because he is a person. What does that look like maybe practically, like at King's Church in London with the pastor?
A great question. I mean, it actually varies quite a lot depending on the context. So I think if you go, so we have 4 sites, and so if I just talk, actually yesterday's a great example, right? So I'm preaching at 9:30. I preach at a site which probably just around 300 people. And then at 10:30, I preach at a site that has 150 people. And back to the bigger site, which is by now has got more like 400 people in it, and preach there. And then I was hanging out in London during the day. And then we had a prayer meeting in the evening for the first day of our week of prayer. And all 4 of those services in some ways handle the dynamic you're asking about, Pete, in a slightly different way. So the prayer meeting, I've found sometimes the category of deep end, shallow end to be quite helpful. My friend Dave Smith uses that language, and it's helped me because a prayer meeting has got a deep end setting in the sense that it's for people who can already swim, or people who are prepared to jump in even if they aren't sure. And so it's not just very noisy, it is more spontaneous. So within 10 minutes of the worship starting, somebody's got up and brought a pretty clear prophetic word for us to pray into, and then 2 or 3 other people bring public prophetic words in the course of that meeting, still led. The senior pastor's actually leading the meeting, he's shaping it accordingly, going, I think we need to press into that, and actually just leave that for now. But then it's right now groups, and we're going to pray for the Spirit to fill people in groups of 3 or 4, go, and then we're all going to lift our voices together, and then if you can't do that, pray in tongues. So it's very much a charismatic, meeting without very many, spouts or rails or guardrails or whatever. But the Sunday morning service is not like that in the same way. And it's actually less like that in the larger services where we get a lot of new people and new guests, because it's disorienting, it's confusing, it's hard to explain everything every time you do it. You could waste a lot of your meeting allowing something odd to happen and then having to explain it. And so on in the prayer meeting, we had somebody spoke in another language. I give the gift of tongues, and came, and it was just like this sort of moment of quiet immediately afterwards. But on a Sunday morning, I've been at the church 7 years. I don't think that's ever happened at our largest site, and partly by design. In fact, very much by design. We'd say actually that in this meeting, given what it's doing, given who's coming, given how we don't know lots of the people here because it's a big, what we call a fringe, a lot of people who are guests all the and therefore we also need microphones, so we need to funnel it through the front more, so we don't just have people shouting out where they are, because we don't think that will be edifying in the context of meeting it. Mm-hmm. And then you'd across our 6 Sunday services that some of them, that would be the sort of 2 extremes, probably the prayer meeting and the 11:30 meeting at our biggest site. And then the others would be somewhere on that trajectory. But mostly we would differentiate between small group life, prayer meetings, and events where all the people there are Christians and have probably been around a bit. And people, and contexts where we're saying, no, a lot of this is for new people who might be, a lot of them are new to Christianity, praise God. And a bunch of them are not, but they're new to the church and are still a little bit unsure. So we would try and taper the way we handle it according to the context.
Yeah. And maybe can you just explain that just a little bit more of just like, obviously there, and you do this in your book of just explaining Paul's paradigm in 1 Corinthians 12 of like, you mentioned edifying the church, or like in the gathering, Paul seems to be at least acknowledge that there are unbelievers or people, not yet believers, people who might stumble into the gathering, and you don't want to confuse them is a huge theme in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 and the using of the spiritual gifts. Maybe just, can you explain it? Like, is that like maybe like your Pauline framework for like why you're doing that at the church the way you are?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, but obviously 1 Corinthians 12 to 14 has got a lot of different arguments Paul's using to try and get the church to kind of pack it in. Like you're showing off. You're not doing it for other people. You're doing it because you're trying to express yourself rather than edify the body. You're not doing it out of love for each other. There might be unbelievers. There's a load of different arguments in there. And apart from anything else, one of them is a lot of people just don't understand what you're saying. So if you're doing it, why don't you just try and excel in gifts that people do understand? Because then their faith might be strengthened rather than you just having a lovely time praying in tongues. And so he uses a lot of different arguments to try and help the church, the chaos that's taking place. But yeah, the paradigm you draw out in 1 Corinthians 14 to me is crucial, because Paul's assumption in Corinth is there's a lot of people who, I did my PhD work on 1 Corinthians, and one of the things that I found that I'd never realized until I went and did a deep dive was how much in Corinth the problem is that the walls between the world and the church are very small. And it's actually they're just bleeding into each other all the time. So they're having sexual relationships together and suing each other, and they're running businesses together, and they're getting married to each other, and they're having each other around for meals, and they're worshiping at each other's idol temples and all the rest. And you think some of those things are good, some bad, some might be, depends. But in that particular city, like mine and probably like yours, there's plenty of unbelievers coming into church. There's plenty of people there who genuinely don't know what's going on. And so if you're really clear on the work of Christ, you're clear on the resurrection, you're clear on the cross, which 1 Corinthians begins and ends with a passage on the cross, a passage on the resurrection. Great. Then do that, and unbelievers will get that, and love one another, and unbelievers will get that. But the more out there it becomes, the less edifying that is, not just for the other believers who don't understand what you mean, but for the city who could walk in and go, what on earth is this? This doesn't make any sense. They think you're out of your minds. And so that doesn't mean you don't prophesy in Sunday meetings, but it means that when you do it in such a way that it is, the aim is, I'm trying to edify, I'm trying to build up. I want people to hear this and go, wow, God is here. And if they just go away going, man, these guys are odd, I haven't actually done what the spiritual gift has been given to me and to the church for. I might be having a great time, and I love that kind of thing personally, but it's not edifying to the people who have come in to listen to it, to hear the word. So yeah, that if you call it a Pauline paradigm, you're absolutely right. That is at the heart of how we're trying to steward it. And what I find fascinating is that Paul does not say, shut it all down. He actually, beginning and end of that chapter, 1 Corinthians 14, it says, earnestly desire, zealously pursue spiritual gifts, especially, but then he goes, but in the church, tongues out loud, untranslated or uninterpreted, is not very edifying. So make sure they're interpreted or prophesy instead. And I think it's just such wise counsel, is pursue the gifts of the Spirit, but do it in a way that builds up the church.
Yeah, it's so good and helpful. Hey, why don't you talk for just a minute? I mean, because we're talking about the way the gifts play out in the gathering, in the worship gathering, but what about in just like community life, right? If we see that the gifts are given for the common good of the church, and so maybe talk a little bit about how that plays out in just, everyday life together as believers who are on mission together, but also living together in a particular context at a particular time as the church.
Yeah, so I think I think it starts, and then I'd actually build quite a lot around the expression of the gifts in the gathered church meeting, because I think that's where people learn how to use them and learn how to use them wisely, such that they're being shaped and directed by those with other gifts than they have, which is why Paul makes so much of the body picture, I think, in part is, the body is that in the end, the eye is not seeing for the sake of the eye. The eye is seeing for the sake of the rest of the community, and doesn't really have a role as a freestanding eye. It's intended to function the way it does when it's part of a whole body. And so I think spiritual gifts in that sense are the primary, secondary, and tertiary uses of the gifts. And there are moments when you use the gifts and nothing to do with the gathered church. Of course there are, and a lot of that happens in the book of Acts. But when Christians are coming to the gifts and thinking, how are these best practiced and shaped, the gathered church community, whether it be on a Sunday or in a prayer meeting or in a small group or whatever, but just a gathering with friends, is intended to be corporate. It's intended to be used for the edification of the body, on the assumption that no one person has all of the gifts and they all need one another. That, I think that's important to say up front. But it does percolate through into ordinary life, and probably depends a little bit on what the gift is as to how it manifests itself in ordinary life. So if you have, as I think I do, the spiritual gift of teaching, which probably all three of us do, right? I'm assuming, that's partly why we do what we do. That's a gift that in many ways will be used. It will be used quite differently from somebody who said, actually, I've got the gift of speaking in tongues, or I've got the gift of healing, or the gift of prophecy, because the way in the context in which I will use that gift are more likely, in a sense, to be, for a start, gatherings in which there is some sort of Bible passage being read or studied and people wanting wisdom on it and that kind of thing. And so there might well be almost like a mini church service, even in a small group, taking place if I'm using my teaching gift. If somebody's speaking in tongues, which I also do, I'm speaking in tongues primarily. That's something I do in my own prayer time. I do speak in tongues in public meetings when many, in a context of, right, okay, now we're all going to pray out together. You may want to pray in English, pray in languages, and I just will toggle between the two. But primarily, that's something that I'm doing, as Paul, I think, does, mainly as a prayer language. That's what he's describing, I think, in 1 Corinthians. He said, I pray in tongues more than all of you. So that's something but primarily he's using that gift in his personal prayer life, which is what I was praying in tongues this morning in my kitchen. That's how that would work itself out. So might be the outer markers of the spectrum, and then there'll be the other gifts, depending on what the gift is, are going to be used differently. Someone with a spiritual gift of healing is obviously going to use that gift in the church, but that friends of mine who have got a powerful gift of healing will often be desperate to use that gift rightly, literally in the streets, as in they do what it just stunts to get people to stop and just put up signs saying free healing, or come here, and then they'll just pray for people and speak healing over people and see them healed literally on the streets of the town they live in. And that's a very public form of the gift, which isn't being used in the gathered church anything like as often as it would be in the public community. So I think it does depend on what the gift is, but the primary setting for all of those spiritual gifts, I think, is within the gathered church, where the body as a whole is functioning as it's meant to.
Yeah, totally. And it's obviously so helpful when people are coming together and they can see how the gifts are manifested together, and then see how they play off of each other. It really does give someone that body illustration in the flesh, like literally in the flesh, as it's lived out collectively.
Yeah.
What would you say to, say, a church that is wanting to grow in its giftedness, to get to the place to where, because one of the things that I think we've had a challenge with is trying to identify like who has what gifts, and then how can we collaboratively work together to not just know about the gifts, but then actually use the gifts together and partner together in various different ways to complement each other. What things have you guys done maybe as a church to grow in that way? And what kind of things do you think churches should focus on to grow in their giftedness?
Yeah, so I think probably one thing I'd want to say is just that growing in giftedness, obviously, I think I know what you mean, in the sense that there are a particular range, a few of the spiritual gifts that churches are going, well, actually, we've always been good at these things, but we're just not so good at this. I don't want to get the impression at all that my church is like just more gifted than everyone else is. That's not the case at all. But I think what happens is a lot of churches saying we've got a lot of practice at the gifts of helping and giving and serving and administrating and leading and maybe preaching and teaching and others. It's usually, I'm assuming, people are talking about prophecy, languages, healings, miracles. That's often what they I'm misreading it, but I'm assuming that's behind the question. Because I think in any of those other areas, you'd say, well, we all need to grow in all of those gifts, and you would be able to teach me a lot about how to develop those. I think when it comes to the more sort of the prominent supernatural gifts that are often the sort of the wedge question in the discussion, I think it's starting. I've a guy is completely out of context, but it helped me when I was in my early 20s. Just talked about Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth. They're kind of growing out like that. Often these things start with leadership teams, even, and the pastors and spouses get together and pray and talk about the week, and they just lead, and there might literally be 6, 8, 10 people there, and you just normalize some of these practicing gifts and taking risks and getting it wrong and then laughing about it and then going, actually, was that right? How do we handle that? How do we feel about this in that sort of setting? And then you bring staff into it. I got to go to a church a couple of years back, an Acts 29 church in the States that is probably a bit further down the track than most US churches would be, but probably was still looking to us as if we were a little ahead of them on it. I don't know. But they had begun to gather a group of trusted prophetic individuals who they would meet and pray with, but with a couple of the key pastoral staff there leading and shaping the meeting, but having a lot of time praying into it and so on. And that might have been a gathering similar size, actually, but with a few people who are not a little bit, further from the kind of the core decision-making body. And then then you introduce it into prayer meeting settings, like I was saying. And then Sundays, in many ways, are the last Sunday morning gatherings are often the last moment in which these things come out. Because if not, what happens is the errors and the chaos and the fear and the things that can kick in are still playing out in the leaders when bombs are being dropped on the Sunday morning, and there's genuine confusion even amongst the pastors as to how to handle it. So I think if you're giving it time, it doesn't need to take years. We're giving it time, saying, well, we're just going to do this, and when we pray on a weekly or monthly basis as elders or whatever we do, we'll work on this here, and just this would be something. It's not the only thing, which is something we're doing, but as that becomes more native to us, it sort of spills out, and then we will quite deliberately have probably. I think prayer meeting contexts, if you have them, are a really good setting in a kind of normal evangelical church where you have very few visitors, probably known unbelievers, and most of the people there are quite core, mature Christians, because otherwise they wouldn't bother turning up to a prayer meeting. And that makes it quite a good setting in which to go, we're just going to try something that we haven't done before and lead into this, and here's why. So that's the sort of model. It sort of start small and spread out would probably be the heart of it.
Yeah, it's super helpful. Thank you for that. So when as you have led your church, you've got multiple sites. We have multiple locations too. Have you seen like certain parts of the body grow in different ways? And if so, how has that played into the way that you're leading the church through to grow in giftedness and maturity and all the various ways? Maybe talk to us just about the complexity of being, multiple sites and how that plays out.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we have, and I'm not quite sure what I think about it. I think there are two factors that is very obvious to me are driving the differentiation between sites in some of the use of spiritual gifts. One is just size, which is not just related to mechanics, like you need a microphone at the front or whatever. People can't hear you, but it's also related to the number of new people who are there, as we were saying earlier, and also how well the people responsible for shepherding that meeting and making sure that nothing damaging is happening, how well they know everyone in the room. So you can open things up much more widely if you know everyone there. Whereas if you've got, there's 30% of these people, I don't know their names, which is honestly the case in our largest site meeting. It's a great problem to have, but it does mean that then you've got to be more discerning about the way in which the spiritual gifts are practiced. So I think that's one factor that definitely drives a difference. So we would find our smaller sites, it's easier to be a bit, to take a risk and safer than it is in the large ones. I think the other factor, though, is actually the mode and primary spiritual gift or gifts of the leader of the site or the primary pastoral voice on the site, which may or may not be the senior pastor of the whole church. And obviously people do multi-site churches in different ways, but In our context, because so many of the spiritual gifts come out during the time of sung worship rather than in the middle. I never get interrupted in the middle of a sermon by somebody with a prophetic word. It happens in Corinth. Whether or not it should is another matter. But that's not normally how it happens in our context. It happens before the message or after the message. So I'm often not there in that section of the meeting if I'm traveling around. The primary shaper in that sense in each site might be the site leader, and their gifts and their sometimes preferences, philosophy of ministry, which we try and retain pretty close alignment on as a church, and we work quite hard at that. But even so, if you have somebody who is very prophetic, it's bound to spill out in the site. And if you have somebody who's just not there, more naturally an evangelist, teacher, and they're not naturally a prophetic person, and they don't speak in tongues themselves personally, whatever it might be, that will shape the site, because people do take their cues from their pastors, and rightly so. So those two things, I'm very aware, do shape the differences, and that would probably be where I'd begin. So yeah, we do see it. We don't worry unduly about the fact that there is a bit of range. And we find very occasionally people say, I actually prefer being in that site because of it suits me more. And that's where I go, well, there's not a lot I can do about that. I don't want that to be that different. And they are wildly different, but there is certainly a difference of emphasis in the time of sung worship. I think of our outer markers sites or outer marker meetings, I think there is quite that you would notice the difference. And whether that is a problem for the multi-site gurus who say, oh no, you're doing it wrong, they've got to all be identical. We just haven't quite worked out how to do that, if that's right.
Yeah, that's helpful. Appreciate that.
Yeah, multi-site gurus there. Of course you do that. They grow. That's where they grow, right? Is in North America. Right?
Yeah, nobody has it figured out, right? We're all just learning and growing and kind of stumbling our way, hopefully closer to Jesus as the days pass. Maybe when as you were saying that, it really made me think like, and I'm making an assumption here, but based on how you were describing that, I was thinking, you must have a culture of accepting and embracing and celebrating the gifts, and like embracing the unity in Christ and diversity of gifts in order to pull that kind of thing off. As you guys as a church have tried to develop your culture, maybe your leadership team culture, and then the culture among the members of the church, maybe talk to us a little bit about how you've cultivated a celebration of the gifts and an appreciation of the gifts, and trying to help people not just, we don't just celebrate this gift or that gift, but we want to celebrate all the gifts. Like how have you led them in that, and what does that look like for you guys?
So I'm not the senior pastor, so I don't lead the whole church. I do more of the teaching than anyone else, but I don't actually lead the church. And Steve, who leads the church, has been there 30 years. So this is actually pretty established. And I think even before that, actually. So it is worth saying the center of gravity in Britain and the US is in a slightly different place. The sort of mainstream, if you've got a sort of random publication or Bible Week or some parachurch thing in Britain that represented the middle of evangelicalism, it would be quite a lot more charismatic just by default than the natural one would be in the US. In my experience, traveled a bit in the US. So it's not actually in Britain. It's not very difficult to have a church. People are assuming that the spiritual gifts might be believed in and sometimes practiced. I think the challenge we have is a bit like the one I was just talking about, how we work that out in the larger and more guest-friendly meetings and site kind of dynamic. And how we don't end up with a thing where we say, well, we do this, but in a kind of Gnostic secret club that we have called a prayer meeting, but on Sunday on and none of that. We don't want the gap between those two things to become so large that people turn up at the prayer meeting and they're like, I didn't know you believed any of that. In our context, that is not as hard as it sounds, though, because a lot of, in our church is actually a black majority church. We've got many people in the church who come from a Pentecostal, who come from the black church. They come from often quite Pentecostal backgrounds. And even if they've come from a Baptist or black Anglican background, they will still often have quite a lot of familiarity with spiritual gifts. The history of the black church is just much more into prayer and in spiritual power. And that's where the emphases are different than they are in the white, more Reformed church. That would probably be more typical in many parts of the US and probably in Britain. And so it isn't a battle we particularly need to fight in terms of going, hey guys, the Spirit is alive. He just still does things. The church is going, yeah, we know. Why don't you get with the program or whatever it is? So we just don't have that challenge in that way. And so I don't really know what I would do were I to be leading in a setting where there was a lot more caution about it culturally. I think you're absolutely right. You have to create space for people to be able to learn and make mistakes and go, that happened and to be able to laugh about it. I'm pretty sure that were I to be in that position, you just have to lead from the top. You have to, so that the leaders have to model failure and embarrassing gaffes and taking steps of faith and saying, I believe the Holy Spirit's speaking about this. And then it just goes quiet and no one responds. And instead of that, trying to waffle your way out of it and go, yeah, do you know what? Maybe you could come and see me afterwards. You just go, as I've seen someone do, just say, okay, that would be a great example of me making a complete mess of it. And then you move on with the meeting. Like creating that sort of culture is vital, because without that, the bar for stepping out in a spiritual gift becomes so high that no one attempts to reach it. And then, of course, what in the end happens is that the only people who are, quote, allowed to use spiritual gifts are the leaders. And that doesn't serve the people. It actually creates the same sort of hierarchical thing that you're trying to get away from by running the church as a body. So that's me guessing what I would do in that situation. But honestly, in our context, that's not the issue we have.
Mm-hmm. Do you see that it's important, like for at least maybe on the culture side of things, more when it comes to the spiritual disposition of the people you're leading? Like when I read the Bible, like especially from the Psalms to the Gospels, like hunger and thirst are huge themes that the psalmist and even Jesus uses to describe how we as humans should long for and view him. And that oftentimes the gifts are the ways that we do interact with God. So like obviously prayer and communion are the sacramental gifts you talk about in the book, are tangible ways where we can communicate and long for hunger, thirst for God. And even just more of the charismatic or sign gifts are also ways, like you mentioned earlier, like eagerly seeking, like that language evokes this idea of like, I should long for this. I should hunger for this. I should thirst for this. How do you as a pastor try to, bring that out of the people you're shepherding, of where it's like, you should hunger and thirst for God in a way where he is like your bread and your water. The same way you need this to survive.
Pete, just like that, exactly what you just done. And I love what you just said, because I do think I'm really glad that we haven't kind of passed on this conversation without making this point. That actually getting people to hunger and thirst for God, not getting people to hunger and thirst for particular gifts. Those are not mutually exclusive. Of course, you do pursue prophecy, but I think if Paul was forced to choose, do you want to pursue prophecy or pursue Jesus? Do you know what I mean? You'd be like, oh, no, this is a means of drawing people closer to Jesus, which is why you do. And I was just preaching on this just yesterday, as it happens, as we're talking about spiritual habits, that you use the illustration of young children who climb onto a chair in order to reach a tin of biscuits. And you say, actually, these spiritual practices are there to help us get what we really want, which is God. And God is, as the deer pants for water, so my soul longs for you, not so my soul longs for tongue, prophecy, healings, whatever. But those things, praise God, are means by which we encounter God and experience his love and goodness. So I'm really glad you said that. And yes, I think a church that is fervent for God is actually not going to find it as difficult as it sounds to be fervent for gifts. I think where you have problems are churches where fervency and intensity and zeal and those sorts of things are just not really the way we. Then no doubt they are true of many of the members, but they're not publicly exhibited. People don't feel comfortable expressing enthusiasm about anything. That's just not the way that the culture is set. Now, even this conversation with the two of you, that doesn't seem to, I very much doubt that's the problem where you are. But I do think that can be an issue, that a church can have a culture where things are just a bit more distant. People aren't as physical. They're not as expressive. They're not as emotional. And in a setting like that, a number of the more spectacular spiritual gifts are going to be treated with a lot more caution at best and often, outright suspicion at worst. Whereas I think where people are saying, to be honest, I love Jesus. I want to go after him with my whole heart. And I will crash sometimes and I'll make a mess of it. And there's lots of, people recovering from addictions in the mix. And there's lots of people with special needs in the mix. And there's lots of people who are just like, they love Jesus, but their lives are not as ordered as they often might be in a kind of more traditional context. So actually spiritual gifts are often not as much of a stretch in a setting like that, because people are expecting a certain degree of, fluency and change and disruption and that sort of thing by the nature of the people that God has gathered together. So I'm really glad you said that. And I think the way you do it is by doing exactly what you've just said, which is to prioritize the desire for God over the desire for those manifestations, but knowing that often those manifestations will lead us into closer encounter with God.
Yeah, thanks.
Man, that's so good. You know, it almost makes me wonder, like, you know, you were talking about how fear can play into people not embracing the gifts, but there also can be even kind of a resistance of holding back from really hungering for God that can also play into it. And, you know, one of the things that I think the church in America needs to learn and grow in, by and large, is understanding the various modes of expression and experience of God. You know, being able to emotionally connect with God, express ourselves to God, and receive expression from God, and connect with God in all those various ways. It seems to me that, you know, when you look at like the church in different parts of the world, you'll see that they're much better at that. They're more, they're more connected to God in certain ways, whereas in the States, people tend to be a little bit disconnected. They're a little bit more isolated. They're a little bit more reserved. And I think that that's something that as a church, you know, we are trying to grow in, is how to emotionally connect, experientially connect with God. Do you find a lot of resistance in your culture and your context for that? Or is that more normative, given kind of the lay of the land in your context?
Yeah, it's funny being on this foot, because it's normally the English are the reserved, you know, the sort of, they're like Jason Isaacs in The Patriots, you know, sort of very like this. And then, and the Americans just like, wow, Yankee, you know, all over the place. Actually, I found in church, you know, there's plenty of that stiff upper lip reserve in a large sections of the British, you know, church, particularly in the more sort of, you know, establishment-y, reformed-y, Anglican-y world. But that isn't my context. It's actually the context I was baptized into as a baby. I was christened in a church like that. My parents then went from there to a charismatic commune, and about when I was 3. And so I sort of went from the kind of St. Helens Bishopsgate, you know, the name Dick Lucas, you know, these great amazing preaching reform types, through to, you know, revival time kind of thing. And so I've been both in my background, but our church, that is just isn't the issue. As I say, partly because of our context, where we are in our city. It's just a lot of immigration, second, third generation, a lot of the Windrush generation, former West Indians who in our community, and a lot of Africans. So it just, that isn't, we're not going, hey guys, loosen up. That's not. If anything, that someone like me with a sort of theological background and wanting to, you know, preach and get into detail on that sort of stuff in passages, I'm sort of going, guys, we treasure the word, and of course the church love that as well. But I'm not having to push the church in the kind of let's loosen up. Actually, sometimes I might be the guy who's like, okay, but yeah, let's get into a sermon. Come on, then, you know, teaching pastors going to do. So that's just the contextual issue, and I think I would have to look very, very different. And we would all, as a team, if we were just transplanted even a few miles away to a more upper middle class white area in London, same city, maybe we might have a very different dynamic in the church, probably be smaller as well, and we just have to work through different challenges than the ones we do. So yeah, I was a pastor in Eastbourne, but the building I'm speaking from now, actually the building of the church that I used to be a pastor in for 7 years before I moved to London. A problem there either, because the church was planted and established with unashamedly charismatic background as part of a renewal movement in the 1980s. And so I think what's hard, the challenge you face that I've never had to face actually, is how do I take on or lead a church that is still got a number of questions about this, but that wasn't the foundation of the church, and say, actually, I think there's some things that we need to renew. I've had to lead the church like that in other areas. We've had to do it with respect to the sacraments, which Pete was alluding to earlier, so I have the opposite problem, which is almost people going, this is very formal and routine. You know, if it's not spontaneous, does that count? Or so I've got that challenge going, so you get the church to all pray the same words at once. People initially feel that's really strange. So I do have the challenge you have, just in the opposite direction, for what that's worth.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I was just like thinking about like just in the culture, like the not yet Christians, probably the two types of churches they most like are like, I want to stay away from that, is either high church, really stuffy, old people dying, is this image that they have, which is not true. There are definitely high church churches where like young people are coming back into them. Totally. No, I'm not making a generalization, but in general, I am making a generalization. But then the other one is more of like this, like charismatic, this idea in their head of like, oh, all these, crazy things happen in the gathering, like snake healing or things they see like on TV. And so I was just thinking of like not yet believers, but then it's like you, in your book, you're putting forward of like, no, we need these two things together. And that's going to be the thing that shows people both like the stability and faithfulness of God, that he, but then also of like that he is, an actual person interacting with us, not this just far off deity that we believe these certain doctrinal things. And so I don't know, even in our context, like in here in Tacoma, like it's so easy for us, or as we come into this new age where it's like spiritualism is going up, yet we think it's weird to do these gifts. Whereas like people pray to crystals, and like that is growing within the culture of like, I want to be in tune with, the moon phases and all these like mystical things. But then we seem to in the church be like, well, we don't want to handle these like mystical things that were passed down from generation to generation within the church. So maybe even just, I guess the question I have is more so when it comes to like non-believers or not yet believers, how do you think your book of holding these two things together, creeds and confessions, sacramentality, and also just like the gifts and the charismatic, how do you think that's actually a benefit to the witness of the church and even just people who don't yet believe yet?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I think it is, and I wouldn't have written the book in the way if I thought, oh, this is terrible for unbelievers, but do it anyway. That probably wouldn't go down very well. But I think it is in part, and I think I touched on this book, that there is people are wired very differently and encounter God. Fascinating conversation with a guy who's in British, quite a well-known secular author. He writes history books, and it's become well-known. He's reviewed in all the newspapers and very successful podcasts and so on. And we were talking about, he said actually the two types of churches that most appealed to him were exactly the two that you just mentioned. He didn't know that I was writing a book on it. And obviously I told him and sent him one, but he's, the sort of the very properly traditional high thing where there's a sense of awe and transcendence. And he'd been to as part of his research, he'd been to a bouncing off the walls charismatic thing. And what frustrated him was the sort of squishy, wet handshake kind of crowd in the middle who didn't want it to be too historically rooted or too expression and exuberant. And he doesn't speak for everybody. There are some people who do find that clearly that is more their cup of tea, to use a very English expression. But I think that actually a church that's leading into both doesn't isolate itself in quite the same way as a church that majors only on one. I think there are charismatic churches you can go to, and somebody with, to be honest, a certain level of even education might go, I just don't think I'm going to feel welcome here, because I just don't think these people are talking and articulating what they're doing and why in a way that I feel is rigorous enough to satisfy that part of me, even if I believed it, which I'm not sure I do. And similarly, there are churches, if there's sort of no attempt to reach for the heights of, and we don't do, we don't have choirs, and well, we do have choirs actually, but not choirs like the organs and the kind of high vaulted ceilings. That's not our experience at all. We just can't build buildings like that in London with enough land. So, but I think but there are things that you do when you gather together. You're attempting to reach for something that's showing that the shallowness of the world you're in is just not deep enough, and that there is something here that we want to touch and we want to present to you, and we want to reach for it, and we want to even tap into things that are hundreds, thousands of years old as a means of anchoring people in the realities of the Christian tradition. And there's an apologetic benefit to that as well, because if you haven't got your roots in tradition, then a lot of cultural issues actually become a lot harder to articulate as well. So I think I'm not saying that means that every kind of unbeliever would walk into our church and go, it's great, it's perfect. No church is going to say that. But I do think that churches that specialize too much, that say, well, we're going to lean heavily this way, but there's going to be nothing exuberant or nothing whoa, otherworldly or transcendent taking place here, or nothing that's new and that's 2,000 years old. Churches that specialize too much and that don't have enough of trying to bring those things together will find a whole bunch of people and go, yeah, I just can't imagine myself coming to church. There are no doubt people who would say exactly the same of my church, but I hope that the group of people that are in that category is smaller by virtue of trying to keep some of those things together.
That's so good. That's so good. I think we've hit our time limit, and you actually ended on just the very thing I was wanting you to talk about. And so I think that's a good place for us to wrap up. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. And you've just been so generous with us to share your story.
It's lovely to talk. I love this kind of thing. Obviously, I've never been to Tacoma, but it's just lovely to see friends and brothers who are doing similar things. And thank you so much for the encouragement as well.
Yeah. Well, you have a standing invitation to Tacoma.
Yes. Oh, thank you very much. That's very good.